By the time the church bells rang on Christmas Eve, no one expected the night to unfold the way it did. The streets of this small Filipino town were already alive. Children clutching lanterns made of colored cellophane, families balancing pots of food, laughter echoing between modest homes decorated with blinking lights that had survived years of reuse. It looked like any other Pinoy Christmas Eve. Warm, crowded, imperfect, and deeply human. But hidden beneath the familiar sounds of carols and firecrackers was a quiet tension, a sense that something fragile was about to be tested. Earlier that day, a single moment, small, almost forgettable, had set off a chain reaction that no one could reverse. By midnight, phones would be raised, cameras would be rolling, and a story born in this overlooked corner of the Philippines would ripple across continents, forcing millions to question what kindness really looks like when no one expects it. The town itself wasn't special by global standards. It didn't appear on travel lists or glossy postcards. What it had instead were people who survived on routine and resilience, fishermen who woke before sunrise, mothers who stretched meals without complaint, children who learned early that joy didn't require much. Christmas Eve was sacred here, not because of extravagance, but because it was the one night everyone paused. Even disagreements were postponed. Even hardships were softened. Yet earlier that afternoon, an argument broke out near the public market, loud enough to draw stares, sharp enough to linger. It involved a visiting foreign vlogger, a local vendor, and a misunderstanding that quickly spiraled. Words were exchanged that shouldn't have been said. Accusations were made that cut deeper than anyone realized. And although the crowd eventually dispersed, something remained unsettled, like a match struck but not yet blown out. The foreigner didn't mean to cause harm, at least not intentionally. He had come chasing authenticity, hoping to capture real life for an audience thousands of miles away. What he didn't understand was that authenticity here wasn't something you extracted. It was something you were invited into. His camera lingered too long. His questions pushed too far. And when frustration crept into his voice, it carried an edge that locals instantly felt. The vendor he argued with, a man barely making enough to get through the week, kept his composure, even when pride was bruised in public. People watching whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene. Christmas Eve had a way of making people choose peace over confrontation. The foreigner eventually walked away, uploading a short clip with a dismissive caption. Within hours it would gain traction online, but not for the reasons he expected. As evening settled in, the town returned to its rituals. Families gathered around tables that held more meaning than food. Prayers were whispered, not rehearsed. Outside, children practiced songs they'd been singing since December began. But somewhere between the second verse of a familiar carol and the smell of rice steaming in kitchens, phones started buzzing. The clip from the market was spreading, first among Filipinos abroad, then among viewers who had never set foot in Southeast Asia. Comments poured in. Some were angry, others were defensive. Many were confused. What stunned people most wasn't the argument itself, but the context. It happened on Christmas Eve, in a place known for warmth, generosity, and patience. The contrast was jarring. And yet, the story was far from over. Because while the internet was choosing sides, the people in that town were quietly preparing to do something no algorithm could predict. The vendor went home that night not knowing he had become the center of a growing storm. His concern wasn't online reputation or viral clips. It was whether he could afford enough food for Noche Buena. His wife noticed the way he avoided eye contact, how his usual jokes were absent. She didn't press him. Years of shared struggle had taught her that silence often carried more weight than words. Meanwhile, neighbors began arriving, each bringing a small dish, a bit of rice, a piece of chicken, offerings that weren't planned but felt instinctive. No one mentioned the video. No one spoke of the argument. They came because that's what you do when Christmas Eve feels heavier than usual. And unknowingly, this quiet gathering, This ordinary act of community was about to become the most powerful part of a story the world hadn't fully seen yet. Across the ocean, the foreign vlogger refreshed his screen, watching the numbers climb. Views multiplied faster than any video he had posted before. But with them came a flood of messages he hadn't anticipated. Viewers from different countries questioned his tone, his words, his timing. Filipinos living abroad shared their own stories of being misunderstood, underestimated, spoken to without care. What started as a clip meant to entertain had become a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths back at its creator. For the first time that day, he hesitated. He rewatched the footage, this time without the sound. The body language told a different story. The vendor's restraint, the crowd's discomfort, the imbalance that had felt invisible before suddenly stood out. By the time Christmas Eve midnight approached, he made a decision that would pull him back into that town, this time without a script. Back in the Philippines, the night deepened. The vendor's small home filled with conversation and laughter, fueled by shared food and shared history. Someone suggested going to the midnight mass together. Children grabbed jackets. Candles were lit. As they walked toward the church, no one noticed the quiet figure standing near the entrance. A familiar face now stripped of confidence, holding nothing but his phone and a folded piece of paper. The foreigner had arrived alone. No camera crew. No live stream. Just him. When he saw the vendor, he froze. This wasn't the confrontation he had rehearsed in his head. This was something more human, more disarming. People noticed the tension immediately. Whispers spread. A moment hung in the air. Uncertain, fragile, waiting to break one way or another. What happened next didn't involve raised voices or dramatic gestures. It began with an apology. Awkward, imperfect, but sincere. The foreigner spoke slowly, choosing words that sounded heavier than before. He admitted he didn't understand the weight of the moment earlier that day. He admitted he was wrong. The vendor listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Around them, people stood still, unsure whether to look away or bear witness. When the vendor finally spoke, his response surprised everyone. Not because it was eloquent, but because it was simple. He accepted the apology. No conditions. No lectures. Just a nod and a handshake that lingered longer than expected. Someone nearby wiped away tears. Midnight bells rang. And without planning it, someone captured the moment on video. Not for content, but because it felt historic in the quietest way. That video traveled faster than the first. But its tone was different. There was no outrage, no mockery. Only disbelief. Comment sections shifted. People shared the clip with captions about humility, accountability, and grace. Viewers who had never celebrated Christmas began to understand why it mattered so much to Filipinos. This wasn't about religion or tradition. It was about choosing reconciliation when pride would have been easier. The foreign vlogger posted a follow-up message, taking full responsibility, redirecting attention to the vendor and the community. Donations started coming in, unsolicited and overwhelming. But the vendor made one request: whatever help arrived should be shared among others who needed it. That decision would soon redefine the story once again. By morning, international media had picked it up. Headlines framed it as a viral Christmas miracle, but those who were there knew better. There was nothing magical about it. Only people choosing decency in small, deliberate ways. The town woke up to unfamiliar attention, reporters asking questions, messages arriving from strangers who felt changed by what they had seen. Yet life continued. Kids played outside. Fishermen prepared their boats. The vendor returned to the market, greeted differently now. Not as a symbol, but as a reminder. And as the world kept watching, replaying the footage again and again, one truth became clear. The unexpected turn of events on that Pinoy Christmas Eve wasn't about conflict going viral. It was about kindness quietly winning, exactly when it mattered most. As the story spread beyond social media and into mainstream conversation, something unexpected happened. The narrative stopped being about blame and started becoming about reflection. People from different cultures began projecting their own experiences onto that brief exchange outside a small Filipino church. Office workers in Europe shared it during lunch breaks. Families in the US watched it together after dinner. For many, it wasn't just about a foreigner and a vendor. It was about moments they wished they had handled differently. The humility shown that night felt rare in a world trained to double down instead of step back. Analysts dissected the apology, but missed what locals understood instinctively. The power wasn't in the words, but in the timing. Christmas Eve stripped everyone of excuses. It reminded viewers that accountability doesn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. Sometimes it only needs courage and a willingness to stand in discomfort. The vendor, however, struggled with the sudden attention. Interviews felt invasive. Cameras made him uneasy. He kept insisting that he hadn't done anything extraordinary. To him, forgiveness was normal, it was survival. In his life, grudges were luxuries he couldn't afford. Each day spent angry was a day wasted when work was already exhausting. His neighbors noticed the toll it was taking and stepped in, answering questions on his behalf, redirecting attention toward the community instead of the individual. That collective instinct to protect rather than exploit stood in sharp contrast to the online economy of virality. People expected grand statements, but what they got instead were quiet refusals to sensationalize pain. And that refusal only made the story resonate more deeply with audiences tired of performative outrage and empty apologies. Meanwhile, the foreign vlogger faced a reckoning of his own. Sponsors paused. Some viewers unsubscribed. Others stayed, watching closely to see whether his change in tone would last beyond a single post. For the first time in his career, growth didn't come from shock value, it came from vulnerability. He released a longer video, unedited, acknowledging how easily power hides behind a lens. He spoke about arriving in places with assumptions, mistaking access for entitlement. Comments poured in, not all forgiving but many appreciative of the honesty. What struck people most was his decision to stay offline for several days afterward, resisting the urge to capitalize on momentum. That silence spoke louder than any monetized apology ever could, and it forced audiences to confront a question rarely asked online. What does accountability look like when no one is clapping? Back in the town, donated funds continued to arrive, but distribution was handled with care. Elders gathered, lists were made, needs were prioritized. No one was singled out as more deserving than another. Roof repairs came first. School supplies next. Medical bills quietly settled without announcements. There were no thank you videos, no before and after shots. This was help as it was meant to be. Functional, dignified, and communal. Outsiders struggled to understand why no one was branding the effort. But locals understood something the internet often forgets. Generosity loses its meaning when it becomes performance. And that quiet efficiency, the refusal to dramatize compassion, became another layer of the story that viewers around the world found both unfamiliar and deeply moving. Christmas decorations eventually came down, but the town didn't return to anonymity. Tourists began arriving, not in crowds but in curiosity. Some came looking for the vendor, others just wanted to see the place where something real had happened. What they found surprised them. There were no plaques, no guided tours, just ordinary people living ordinary lives. And that ordinariness challenged the idea that meaningful moments require extraordinary settings. Visitors left talking less about what they saw and more about how they were received, with patience, humor, and a warmth that felt unforced. It was a reminder that hospitality isn't a strategy. It's a posture. And in a world increasingly suspicious of sincerity, that posture felt revolutionary. The conversation online evolved again. Educators used the clip in classrooms to discuss cultural awareness. Churches referenced it in sermons about reconciliation. Even corporate teams used it during diversity trainings, analyzing how quickly misunderstandings escalate when power dynamics go unchecked. What had started as a fleeting moment now carried educational weight. Yet the people at the center of it never claimed ownership of the lesson. They didn't trademark it or define it. They allowed others to interpret it through their own lenses. That openness, letting meaning grow organically, gave the story longevity. It wasn't tied to a trend or a holiday anymore. It became a reference point, something people returned to when discussions about respect, humility, and empathy felt abstract or theoretical. For the vendors' children, life changed in subtle ways. Classmates asked questions. Teachers offered encouragement. They felt pride not because their father went viral, but because he showed restraint and grace when it counted. Home, nothing changed. Chores still needed to be done. Homework still came first. Their father never framed himself as a hero. He framed the moment as a reminder to choose calm when anger feels justified. Those lessons carried more weight than any lecture. And years from now, long after the internet moves on, those children will remember that Christmas Eve not as the night the world watched, but as the night their father showed them what strength actually looks like. The foreign vlogger eventually returned home, carrying more than footage. Interviews followed him, but his answers stayed consistent. He refused to portray himself as redeemed or transformed overnight. Growth, he said, wasn't cinematic. It was uncomfortable and ongoing. That honesty frustrated some, inspired others. He redirected earnings from the original video to long-term community projects, structuring them so locals remained in control. It wasn't charity, it was restitution. And while critics remained, something had undeniably shifted. His platform was no longer just entertainment. It had become a space for learning, even when that learning came at his own expense. What made the story endure wasn't its resolution, but its restraint. There was no villain defeated, no dramatic reversal. Just people meeting each other where they were, choosing humility over ego. In an age where outrage travels faster than understanding, that choice felt radical. The Pinoy Christmas Eve didn't offer spectacle, it offered clarity. It reminded viewers that culture isn't a backdrop for content, and that respect isn't optional depending on geography. Those who watched closely didn't see perfection. They saw effort. And that effort, visible, flawed, sincere, became the most compelling part of all. Months later, when asked why the story still mattered, a local elder gave a simple answer. Because it showed who we are when it's hardest. Not when cameras demand it. Not when applause follows. But when pride whispers and silence feels safer. That Christmas Eve didn't change the world overnight. It didn't solve inequality or erase misunderstanding. What it did instead was smaller, and far more powerful. It showed that even in overlooked places, ordinary people can model extraordinary humanity. And that's why the world couldn't stop watching. Not because it was shocking, but because it was true. Long after the headlines faded and attention drifted elsewhere, the effects of that Christmas Eve continued to surface in unexpected ways. Messages still arrived at the town's community center. Handwritten letters from strangers who said the story changed how they spoke to service workers, how they traveled, how they listened. Some admitted they saw themselves in the foreigner. Others recognized the quiet endurance of the vendor in their own parents. What lingered wasn't guilt or praise, but awareness. People began asking better questions before pulling out their phones. They paused before assuming intent. That pause, brief but intentional, became the invisible legacy of the night. It wasn't dramatic enough to trend again, but it didn't need to. The change it sparked lived in private decisions, made when no one was watching. The town itself resisted becoming a symbol. Leaders turned down proposals to memorialize the event, wary of freezing a living moment into something performative. Life here had always been about motion, ebb and flow, loss and recovery. To stop and point too loudly felt unnatural. Instead, they focused on what they could control, strengthening local systems, supporting one another, preserving the quiet dignity that defined them long before the cameras arrived. Visitors still came, but they were gently guided toward understanding rather than spectacle. The story was shared not as a highlight reel, but as context, a reminder that what happened wasn't an exception, but an extension of values already deeply rooted in the community. The vendor returned to being just a man with a stall, a routine, and responsibilities. Some mornings, customers recognized him and smiled. Others didn't. Both were fine. He preferred anonymity, believing that recognition belonged to the collective, not the individual. When asked privately whether he ever replayed the moment in his mind, he admitted that he did, not with pride but with gratitude. Gratitude that he had chosen restraint. Gratitude that anger hadn't won. Gratitude that his children had seen him choose peace over performance. For him, that was the real gift of Christmas Eve. Not the donations, not the attention, but the quiet certainty that he had acted in alignment with who he wanted to be. The foreign vlogger's journey continued too, though far from the spotlight that once defined it. His content slowed. His tone shifted. He listened more than he spoke. And when he traveled again, it was with permission, not entitlement. Mistakes still happened. He acknowledged them openly, but the difference was intention. He no longer chased moments. He allowed them to unfold. Critics remained, but so did a new audience, one that valued growth over perfection. In interviews, he often referenced that Christmas Eve not as a turning point, but as a mirror, a moment that forced him to see clearly. And once you see clearly, you can't pretend you don't. Educators continued using the footage years later, not because it was viral, but because it was relatable. Students didn't see heroes or villains. They saw people navigating misunderstanding in real time. Discussions shifted away from punishment and toward repair, toward how easily power can distort perspective, and how humility can rebalance it. In a digital age that rewards extremes, this story offered something rare: moderation without indifference, compassion without spectacle. And that balance made it timeless. It wasn't locked to a trend cycle or a holiday. It applied wherever people crossed cultural boundaries with more curiosity than care. Christmas Eve returned the following year, quieter but no less meaningful. Lanterns glowed again. Carols echoed through narrow streets. The vendors' family gathered, just as they always had. No cameras waited outside. No reporters called. And that was exactly how they wanted it. The night passed without incident, filled with laughter and prayer, with plates scraped clean and stories retold. Yet beneath the familiarity was an unspoken awareness that ordinary nights can carry extraordinary weight, that choices made in passing moments can ripple far beyond intention, and that kindness, once witnessed, leaves a trace even when the world looks away. Online, the clips still resurfaced from time to time, usually accompanied by comments from new viewers discovering it for the first time. "I needed this," one would write. "This restored my faith," said another. But perhaps the most telling responses were quieter. People tagging friends. Families sharing it in group chats without commentary. It became a shorthand for something hard to explain. A reminder that decency doesn't require perfection, only effort. And in a digital landscape built on speed and reaction, that reminder felt grounding. What made the story endure wasn't resolution. It was restraint. No one claimed moral superiority. No one demanded applause. The town didn't brand itself. The vendor didn't monetize forgiveness. The foreigner didn't rush redemption. Each refused to turn humanity into content. That refusal, paradoxically, made the story stronger. It allowed people to project themselves into it, to imagine how they might act in similar circumstances. And that imaginative engagement, quiet, personal, unresolved, kept the story alive long after louder narratives faded. Years from now, the algorithms will have moved on completely. New stories will replace old ones. But somewhere, a traveler will hesitate before filming. A customer will choose patience over irritation. A child will remember a parent choosing calm when anger felt justified. These moments won't be traced back to a video or a headline. They'll exist quietly, disconnected from their origin. And that's how you'll know the story mattered. Not because it stayed visible, but because it changed behavior in ways no metric could measure. The unexpected turn of events on that Pinoy Christmas Eve wasn't about conflict going viral or apologies going public. It was about a choice, made without certainty, without guarantee, without reward. A choice to see the person in front of you, not the power you think you hold over them. And that choice, simple as it was, traveled farther than anyone could have planned. The world didn't keep watching because it was entertained. It watched because it recognized itself in the moment and saw briefly what it could be. Thanks for watching.